Hi, my name is Laura, and welcome to my podcast, Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations, and through these discussions, you will hear why 9 times out of 10, the book wins. I'll also share different behind-the-scenes trivia I've discovered in my research, which by learning makes the story all the more interesting. If you love either books, movies, or both, this is the perfect podcast for you. This probably already goes without saying, but there will be spoilers for both the book and the movie in this podcast. So if you plan on reading the book or watching the movie, go do that first, and then come back and listen to this. And now, without further ado, let's get right into it. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I am talking about True Grit, which is a novel by Charles Portis, written in 1968. Then they made a movie by the same name, directed by Henry Hathaway, which was released in 1969, just 1 year later. And then they did another version with the same name, True Grit, directed by Joel and Ethan Coen, which was released in 2010. Before we get into this, I actually have a confession to make. Westerns are not my favorite genre. And that isn't to say there aren't some great ones out there, because there are some that I love. But for the most part, I feel like they tend to be on the boring side for me. And now you might be wondering, Laura, if you don't like Westerns, then what are you doing a podcast on it for? Not only that, but a podcast that has 2 Westerns you're going to have to watch. And now, if I'm being honest, one of the reasons is because the book was quite short, so that was appealing. But I also did want to rewatch the 2010 version, because I had seen that back in theaters with my dad, but I haven't seen it since then. Though after watching it a second time, I now know why I hadn't bothered to watch it before. Not because it's a bad movie, but like I said, Westerns just aren't my favorite, so little disclaimer there. If you don't know the story of True Grit, here is a synopsis. Frank Ross is unarmed when he is killed by his hired hand, Tom Chaney, who was drunk, and his 14-year-old daughter takes it upon herself to see that the law catches Tom Chaney. She finds a U.S. Marshal, Rooster Cogburn, who she hears is no nonsense, and he's tough, and he has a man with true grit. So she hires him to catch him. And before they can leave, they run into a Texas Ranger named LaBeef, who tells them that he is on Tom Chaney's trail because Chaney had killed a senator in Texas. And eventually LaBeef and Cogburn meet, and the 2 of them decide that they don't want Maddie joining them because she's too young and doesn't know what she's getting into. However, she knows they're leaving the next morning, and she ends up meeting them. There's a river crossing, and they get on a ferry to cross the river with their horses, and the guy won't let her on the ferry, but to show she won't take no for an answer, she has her horse cross the river. And they try to lose her by riding fast, but ultimately she sticks with them. The 3 of them ride together, and they stop at a few towns along the way, and then they also run into this hut where these 2 bandits are, and things happen, and they find out that Chaney and Ned is this other bandit that Chaney has taken up with. They find out that they were going to be going to that hut, so they set up an ambush, but things don't go quite as they planned, and Chaney and Ned get away. But the next day they stop at another town and get some information on where they went. They head out in that direction, and Cogburn is leading the way, and he stops them when he says they are about 4 miles from where Ned is and Chaney. And so they're going to settle in for the night, and then tomorrow morning they'll ride the rest of the way and capture them. However, the next morning, Maddie goes down to the stream, and who does she see but none other than Tom Chaney across on the other side of the stream. And so she gets her gun out, and she ends up shooting him in the ribs. However, she tries to shoot him again, but her gun misfires, and so he grabs her and takes her back to the camp with him and his bandits. Ultimately, Ned and all his other people end up leaving Chaney alone with Maddie. And Maddie is like, man, he's going to kill me now, because Ned was keeping Chaney from hurting her, but now Ned's gone. But turns out Cogburn and LaBeef had set up an ambush, and they ambushed Ned and the other bandits who had been leaving. But while that's happening, Maddie gets away from Chaney. She throws hot water in his face, and she ends up knocking him out. And LaBeef also comes up and helps her. And LaBeef helps Cogburn by shooting Ned from a far distance. And so it seems like everything is great again. However, it turns out Tom Chaney, he wakes up because he got knocked out or something. And he wakes up and she tries to shoot him, and she falls back into this pit where there are some sleeping rattlesnakes because it's wintertime. However, because she's down there, she wakes them up, And before she is able to be rescued by Cogburn and LaBeef, a snake bites her. And because she has this venomous snake bite, Cogburn hops on her horse, because that's the only one available. They just ride really fast until they reach the nearest town, because otherwise Maddie will die. And during which time the horse dies of exhaustion, and he carries her the rest of the way. And in the end, she lives. However, she loses her arm, and LaBeef takes Chaney back to Texas, his dead body back to Texas. Maddie loses contact with both of them. She reaches out to Cogburn, inviting him to her home, but he never shows up. However, like decades later, she hears that he's in this Wild West show. So she goes out to see him, but she hears that he had died just a few days prior. And so she has his body shipped to her town and has him buried in the family plot because he had no other family. And that's the end of the book. So I enjoyed the book well enough, and it's written in a very straightforward way. It's written from Maddie's perspective, and she isn't one to embellish on the facts. Her character can get annoying at times, specifically in the beginning when she arrives at Fort Smith, where her dad was killed, and where she meets Rooster Cogburn. She just is like this know-it-all teenager, and she's always threatening her lawyer with everybody. However, as the more time went on, I liked her more and more. Of course, by the end, you learn that, Cogburn has grit, but Maddie is the one who has true grit. And it's a quick read. You could probably finish in one day without a problem. I like that Portis didn't drag things out longer than necessary. And I also like that she, Cogburn, and LaBeef don't remain lifelong friends or something, because I think that would have been too cheesy and not realistic. So I like that they just lose contact over time. And so for the movies, there have been 2 movie adaptations. The first, which I had never seen until now, was released in 1969, and the second was in 2010. So I'll just talk about these chronologically. So the 69 version first. So the acting, we have John Wayne, who plays Rooster Cogburn, and you're probably not surprised the fact that I don't like Westerns. You're probably not surprised by the fact that John Wayne isn't a favorite actor of mine. He just seems to be very one note. And I mean, there are actors, like I mentioned in the podcast for Wonder. There's actors that play similar characters in every movie they're in, but I don't mind because I enjoy their characters. But I guess I'm just not a fan of the John Wayne tough cowboy stereotype. But, maybe I'll try to give him a shot and watch some of his other popular movies and see. And I do remember liking The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance when I was younger. But that could be because it has Jimmy Stewart. And when I was a kid, Jimmy Stewart was my favorite actor. But anyway, he plays Rooster Cogburn. And, as much as I was, not saying anything nice about him earlier, I actually can't say I have any complaints about his acting. Some of the other actors could be a bit wooden, but I thought he was fine. Up until the very end, which was a bit cheesy for my taste. But aside from that, he was fine. Also, a side note, in the book, Cogburn is in his 40s. Whereas John Wayne was in his 60s, so a bit too old. Then we have Glenn Campbell, who was a popular country singer back then. And it was customary in the 60s that every movie have a theme song written for the movie. And whenever you watch an older movie, pay attention because you'll notice there's always a song written specifically for that movie, and it's usually played during the credits. And so the director hired Campbell just because he's a songwriter, and he was like, great, I'll hire this guy. Plus, he can also write the song for us. The director, Hathaway, he actually didn't like the acting, and he thought that, he just didn't have a very good portrayal of LaBeef. And I would agree. I mean, he was fine, but he definitely wasn't anything special. Then we have Kim Darby, who plays Maddie, and she is 23 in this movie. Prior to watching the movie, I read different behind-the-scenes stuff, and I read that a lot of people complained about her acting. But I thought she did fine. Maybe it's because I went into it expecting her to be bad, and so I had low expectations. I don't know, but I thought she was fine. The actor who plays Tom Chaney is Jeff Corey, but his role is very brief. And then Ned Pepper, though, is played by Robert Duvall, who, is a well-known actor, and you'll probably recognize him. This movie actually follows the book almost exactly up until the last 10 minutes. When I was reading about the 2010 version, I read that the directors told Bridges not to focus on the 69 movie because they wanted to focus just on making a movie of the book, not thinking of it as a remake of the 69 version. And when I read that, it led me to believe that the 69 version must stray from the original story. But turns out, like I said, it follows the book really closely. they made like 3 major changes, all of which happened, like I said, in like the last 10 minutes. So some of the smaller changes. In the book, she talks about her dad, of course, and about, why he's going into town and about his good attributes and all that. But this movie, it actually shows the scenes before he goes into town, and it shows her interacting with her dad, as well as the scene of him getting shot. I like that they added that in, especially seeing her interact with him, getting a feel for their bond. Although when it shows him getting shot, there's a crowd that's watching it happen. And in the book, it made it seem like there wasn't anyone around because no one tries to go after him. Also, the book takes place in winter, whereas this movie, it happens in summertime. And when they're in Fort Smith, they go to the hangings. In the book, all 3 men are given time to say something before they're hung, whereas here we don't hear him say anything. Also, when the lever is pulled, there's something up with the lever for the Native American's noose, or there's something up with his noose. And so when the lever is pulled, he wiggles for a while, and it takes a long time for him to die because his neck doesn't break. And this is not shown in the movie, which scenes like this, it always seems so crazy to me that these executions were a public event. People say that our world today is so much worse than it used to be, morally speaking. And yeah, I mean, we do have violent movies and violent video games and all that stuff. So I'm not saying we don't have that, but it's not like they were so perfect back then. They were going to a hanging was a big deal, and people were selling food and stuff while watching these people die. And even worse is when like the deaths were more graphic, like when it's a guillotine or something. Like that seems so crazy to me that people would go see that in person. Anyway, the scene where LaBeef is introduced is fairly close to the book, though in the movie she sees him one night and then talks to him the next night. In the book, it happens all in one night. Also in the book, when he asks who she is, she doesn't say. But the landlady in charge of the boarding house they're both staying at, she's a chatterbox, and so she ends up telling LaBeef all about Maddie. In all 3 versions, she initially offers Cogburn $50, but he ups it to $100, which she agrees to. With movies and books like this, like I know, of course, this is based in the 1870s. And so, of course, I realize that $50 then is more than our $50 today. But I like to look up the exact amount it would be today, like what the inflation is, because it just helps you to really understand the amounts they're talking about. Like in oil, too. I had to do that a lot because they talk a lot about money. And so they would talk about money as if it was this huge amount, but I'd be like, oh, that's not that much. And so I would look up the inflation so I could really get a grasp on it. But anyway, $50 back then is equivalent to $1,000 today. And then he doubled it, so she ends up paying $2,000. So thinking it in that respect, no wonder Cogburn was surprised that she had $50, because that'd be like some 14-year-old walking around with $1,000. And the way she gets the money is by selling the ponies back to Stonehill. And the actor who plays Stonehill in this is Strother Martin, and you'll probably recognize him, which I actually recognized his voice, and then I recognized his face. But he is in Cool Hand Luke, and he has this famous line everybody knows.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
Which, by the way, Cool Hand Luke does have a book, so I'm very excited to read that book and talk about that. But he is also in another Paul Newman movie, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And he has this line, which I don't know if it's considered like a famous movie line, but it's one that's always stood out to me.
I'm colorful. That's what happens when you live 10 years alone in Bolivia. You get colorful.
So there's 2 famous lines that he says. So you'll recognize that when you watch this movie. And he does a good job playing Stonehill. And then another small change is that there aren't really any scenes that take place at night, like at all. It's all during the daytime. Whereas in the book, a lot of the scenes took place at night, either because it was early in the morning or because it was at nighttime. But remember, the book was in wintertime, so there's less daylight, whereas this movie takes place in summer. But I'm guessing they changed that because maybe back then, when they filmed scenes at night, maybe it was harder to see because they didn't have as good technology or something, so just wasn't as visible. I'm assuming that's why they changed that. In both the book and the 1969 movie, Cogburn tells her his history while they're waiting for Ned and his gang to show up at the hut. And in the book, he just kind of rambles on, and Maddie even falls asleep, and he shakes her awake to be like, hey, did you hear what I just said? Whereas in the movie, he doesn't ramble on quite so much. And all the stories he tells, though, are stories that he says in the book. And then a little later, after taking the dead bodies into town, Cogburn, LaBeef, and the sheriff of that town get into a shooting competition, during which time they have a few swigs from their flask, and Cogburn especially takes a lot of swigs and drinks a lot. And I like this scene in the book because usually when there's some shooting scene trying to prove their shot, they end up making all these crazy shots. Like they just over-exaggerate it. Whereas in this book, he, like the first time Cogburn tries to make a few shots, he misses. And then he, LaBeef, and the sheriff just like are all trying to make these shots. And, some of them make them, but a lot of times they end up missing. And so they spend 30 minutes doing this. And this is what leads to Cogburn being especially drunk as they head back towards Lucky Ned. And in the movie, they have him start drinking the night before, and that's why he's drinking. And they do have a brief shooting competition type scene, but it's not quite like it was in the book. Some smaller changes from the end of the movie is when Maddie tells Ned that her gun backfired, and he replies saying how that'll happen sometimes. And in the book, he adds, that'll happen sometimes, and it never stopped being embarrassing, basically. And I like that they added that line in the end and just made Ned more likable. And there's a lot more time spent with her when she's hanging out with this gang. So just getting to know Ned, I guess, was the point of that. And also in the book, they had robbed a train that has mail, and they take time to sort out the mail and figure all that out. And one of the things in it are this check that's worth a lot of money. However, it needs to be signed by someone, and they have a copy of the guy's signature somewhere else. And so Ned has Maddie forge the signature. And he's impressed because she does such a good job. And then when she falls in the pit, like I said in the book, there are a lot of sleeping snakes, but in the movie they just have one. And also in the book, it feels like she's in the pit for much longer. And she starts to fall, or she starts to slip and fall further. And so she tugs at that skeleton, and his arm comes off, and she actually uses that to help her stay in place. Near the end, when Cogburn is riding Little Blackie to save her, which that's the name of the horse, Little Blackie. In the book, he uses a knife to stab the horse to make the horse go faster. And then he later rubs salt in the wound to make the horse continue to go faster. Whereas in the movie, he just slaps the horse with his hand. So not nearly as graphic. Also in this movie, the snake bite isn't so bad, and she doesn't get her arm amputated. So that's another change. But a big change is that they killed LaBeef in this movie. In the book, he survives, and he takes Chaney's dead body back to Texas. But in this movie, after he helps them out of the pit, he dies, and Cogburn takes the body back to Texas. And also, once again, in the book, she never sees either man after that. But she does find out that he's part of this traveling Wild West show, and she goes to see him, but he's dead. However, in the movie, it shows Cogburn at Maddie's home soon after this all happens, like she's still young. He comes back to her home, and she takes him to her father's grave, and she tells him that when he dies, she wants him to be buried here too, since he has no other family. And he accepts. And so that's how they do that. So there's no scene into 20 years into the future. John Wayne actually won an Oscar for his performance, though most people say that they feel like it was given to him like as an honorary Oscar type of thing because he hadn't won one yet in his whole career. And he himself even felt he didn't deserve it for that role. And it seems like a lot of people involved in this just didn't have the best time filming. Both director Henry Hathaway and John Wayne had other actresses in mind that they preferred for Maddie, but they didn't get who they wanted. Sally Field was one they both wanted. And then John Wayne had also suggested Karen Carpenter, who at that time was basically unknown, but he saw her on some TV show he was hosting or something. And he recommended her, but she didn't get the role. Although she went on to have a huge success with her band, The Carpenters, it was her and her brother. Kim Darby says that she didn't like working with Hathaway, the director. And then there was Glenn Campbell, who, as I said, Hathaway also didn't like. So must not have been the most pleasant working environment. Then on to the 2010 version. So with acting, we have Jeff Bridges, who plays Rooster Cogburn. And I love Jeff Bridges. I think he's great in all his movies, and I love watching interviews with him too. And he does a good job playing Cogburn. His voice is hard to understand, which fits the character, so I like it. But I could see people having a hard time understanding him. And as I watched it, it helped that I already knew a lot of the dialogue from the book. But so there's that. And I do think he did a better job than John Wayne, in my personal opinion. And we have Matt Damon, who plays the Texas Ranger LaBeef. And I thought he was well cast. Then we have Hailee Steinfeld, who who does a great job playing Maddie Ross. She was 13 when she was cast, and then during filming, she probably turned 14, or was 14 by the time they started filming. So she was the perfect age for it. And she was also nominated for an Oscar, although she didn't win. But still, being nominated at such a young age seems like a big achievement. In the book, like I said, Maddie can be kind of annoying sometimes, especially when she's haggling with Stonehill. But I thought Steinfeld did a good job, and she made the character more likable. Josh Brolin plays Tom Chaney, and he gets third billing for this movie, but he doesn't even show up until like the last 30 minutes of the whole film. But, I mean, he does a good job. He just isn't in much to be getting a third billing. And this is also a faithful adaptation with just a few changes. This movie doesn't show any scenes with the dad the way the 69 version did. However, I do really like the start of this one. They have the scripture that's used in the book about the wicked flee when none pursueth. And it has the daughter narrating, talking about how her dad was killed. And this movie does take place in wintertime, and so it shows the outside of the boarding house where her dad was shot. And it's this really beautiful scene where, you have the snow falling in the dark, and it shows Chaney riding away on his horse. So a change they had was in this movie, Maddie's first night in town, she sleeps at the morgue because she doesn't have money to stay at the boarding house. And this didn't happen in the book. She spends every night at the boarding house. Having this scene, it definitely had a Coen Brothers feel to it, I thought. So it didn't surprise me they changed that. And then her meeting with LaBeouf is very different. She first sees him as she's walking up to the boarding house. She sees him out front on the deck. And then the next morning she wakes up and he's sitting there waiting for her in her room. And that's when they talk. But definitely kind of a creeper to be in the room watching her while she's sleeping. So that was a big change. And then for this movie, so I didn't mention this, but while Maddie is in Fort Smith in the book, she gets sick and she spends 2 days in bed. 69 movie doesn't show that at all. This one, it mentions her being sick, but it's not, it doesn't affect the plot at all. Like, she's not sick in bed for 2 days. But in the book, there was a part I liked where she's sick because she shares the room with Grandma Turner, and Grandma Turner is also sick, and they're drinking this medicine that Maddie suspects must have had like morphine or something because she was getting kind of loopy. So she and Grandma Turner are both drinking this medicine, and there's a book in the room that's just this silly, entertaining story, and Maddie reads it aloud to keep them from being bored. And she says how there's a few parts that were so funny she rereads it multiple times because she and the grandma were just laughing so much. So I thought that was just a funny scene. This movie also doesn't have the scene where Maddie has dinner with Cogburn. So the 69 version does show this, where she has dinner with him, and the scene where he shoots the rat and they have that whole conversation. And this one does not have that at all. And it also doesn't have the scene where she goes to Cogburn's place and sees LaBeouf there talking with him. Instead, that whole discussion/argument they had at Cogburn's place, instead it happens after she has crossed the river and joins them on the hunt for Chaney. In the movie, this is also when he spanks her, whereas in the book, so they ran ahead to try to lose her, but it's not working, so instead they hide out, and then when she reaches them, they ambush her, and that's when LaBeouf spanks her. And in all the versions, LaBeouf and Cogburn do not get along at all. And in this one, they even have LaBeouf leave them, and he goes his own way. Once again, didn't happen in the book. And so then that leaves Maddie and Cogburn on their own. While they're traveling, they see a man hanging in a tree who's long since dead. And they cut the man down, and then a Native American comes by and he takes the body. And then later they hear a shot fired, and Cogburn says that he had asked the Native American to shoot his gun if he noticed someone was on their trail. And so they think it's LaBeouf. So they stand and wait. Turns out it's not LaBeouf, it's this guy wearing this like bear head as a hat. Once again, this was not in the book, and it had a very Coen Brothers-ish feel to it. And they end up getting information from him rather than information from the town they stop in. Then when they stop at that hut with Quincy and Moon, it follows very closely to the book. However, when they're hiding out waiting for Ned, it's different because LaBeouf isn't with them, and instead LaBeouf arrives at the hut, and then like a minute after he arrives, Ned shows up, and so it kind of changes the interaction that happens. However, it ends the same with, Ned and Chaney getting away. And this also, LaBeouf ends up getting injured and like he bites his tongue, and so then for the rest of the movie he just kind of talks funny. So some comedic humor. And side note, the guy who plays Moon, you might recognize him. It's Domhnall Gleeson, and he's the son of Brandon Gleeson. And like I said, this was 2010, and at this point he hadn't been in very many movies. But 2015 was a big year for him because he was in Ex Machina, The Revenant, the new Star Wars, as well as Brooklyn. And all 4 of those were nominated for Oscars that year. By the way, 2 of those have books, so don't be surprised if you see me mention Revenant and Brooklyn in the future. And also, he has a small role as Bill Weasley in the Harry Potter movies, so you might recognize him from that as well. In this, they also skip the scene where they take the bodies into that town. In this, they just leave them in the hut. In the book, when they go into town to drop the bodies off, they get information on Ned and Cheney, and so they continue to head out on their trail. Whereas in the film, they feel like the trail has gone cold, and they don't know what to do, and they feel like it's probably hopeless. And there's this whole scene where LaBeef is leaving, going a separate way again, and Maddie comes up to him wanting to go with him, and she's like, sorry, I picked the wrong man, can I join you? And he says no, so she stays with Cogburn. Once again, didn't happen in the book. LaBeef never parted ways from them, and she never says that she picked the wrong man. Also, they never believe the trail went cold, because they were always, hot on the trail. Prior to LaBeef leaving, they do have that brief corn dodger, like the shooting competition where they're shooting corn dodgers. They do have that briefly in this movie, similar to the book. And then in the final scenes, when Maddie is going to the river, she sees Cheney and, the subsequent events. They're all the same as they were in the book. LaBeef also does reappear, and he does the same things that he had done to help Cogburn and Maddie. And then when Maddie falls in the pit, they do have multiple snakes, unlike the 69 version. And they also, once again, leave out the part where she uses the corpse's arm to help her. And I'm assuming both movies left that out because it just would have been too graphic. And this one is a PG-13 movie, so they wanted to keep it PG-13. And then also in both movies, Cogburn cuts the snake bite. And when I read this in the book, it made me curious if that's even something you should do. And turns out you should not, because that can lead to an infection and make it even worse. You also shouldn't wash the snake bite because you can wash away the venom. And when you go to the hospital, they need to get samples of that venom so they can know for sure what kind of snake it is. And you also should move as little as possible because you don't want to increase your blood flow because that will cause the venom to reach your heart sooner. So just a few helpful tidbits if you're ever bitten by a snake. Unlike the 69 movie, they do show Cogburn stabbing the horse on his way as a way to make him run faster. However, in this movie, rather than taking her into town, he takes her to this random person's cabin. And like I said, in this version, they don't even stop by that town. So I guess that's why they had her stop at a cabin instead. But the ending is very close to the book where Maddie loses her arm. And she says how she sent a letter to Cogburn inviting him to her place, but he never visits. LaBeef lives, and he takes Cheney to Texas. Then later she hears about the Wild West show he's in, and in the book. So in the book, she finds out about the show because her brother sends her the newspaper clipping, and he circles Cogburn's name because, of course, she told him all about him. And so when her brother sends that clipping, she decides to go see him. But she goes there and finds out he had already died, and she has his body shipped to her. Whereas in the movie, she finds out about the show because Cogburn sends her the clipping, so they changed that part. But aside from that, the ending is exactly the same as the book. And this movie, it was actually nominated for a total of 10 Academy Awards, but it didn't win any. And that, went down in history as being the movie with the most nominations, yet not winning any of them. And that year, the King's Speech, swept up most of the Oscars. Also, as of 2019, this movie has made the most money in the box office for any of the Coen Brothers movies, which I found this surprising because it's definitely not their best movie. However, I think the reason is because maybe 1, it's a remake of a John Wayne movie, and 2, it's rated PG-13, so more people were able to go see it perhaps. And then in the end, between the book and the movies, I would recommend the book. I enjoyed it and it kept my interest and I enjoyed the characters and it wasn't very long, so that helps. And if you read the book and you want to watch a movie adaptation, I would suggest with the 2010 version, even though they did change a number of the things in the story, which is kind of funny because, so the 69 version, the journey towards the end is exactly the same, but then they changed the end. Whereas the 2010 version, they changed the journey, but the ending is the same. Yeah, ultimately, though, I liked the 2010 version better. I thought it was better acting, better cinematography, better directing. But ultimately, once again, the book does win, and I did like that better than both the movies. But yeah, if you have read the book or seen either of these movies, I'd love to hear your opinion. And if you're a John Wayne fan, you can let me know what you think his best movies are, and I will check them out, and maybe it'll give me a more positive opinion of John Wayne. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, head over to my site, whythebookwins.com. You can leave a comment there and I will be sure to reply. You can also find me on Instagram under the same name, Why the Book Wins, and you can message me there, and don't forget to follow. And also don't forget to subscribe to my podcast and join me next Wednesday for the newest episode of Why the Book Wins.